death scarred the Texas dust long before buzzards arrived. A lone rider fleeing a hanging judge stumbled upon a slaughtered wagon train, expecting only ghosts. Instead, he found a battered young woman clutching a silent infant, leveling a rifle at his chest. He came for refuge. He found war. Historical records from the Bexar County Archives of 1883 officially list the massacre at Dead Man's Wash as an Apache raid. The coroner's report noted arrows in the timber and strict horses. But those who truly understood the frontier knew the Apache hadn't ridden that far east in a decade. The truth, buried beneath decades of West Texas dust, was far more sinister, and it began with a man who had nothing left to lose. Jasper Hayes was a ghost with a bounty on his head, a former deputy who had uncovered a cattle-rustling ring operated by the very lawmen he served. Jasper had been framed for the murder of a federal judge. With a piece of hot lead still lodged in his left thigh and a posse 3 days behind him, he was riding hard for the Mexican border. The unforgiving sun beat down on his roan gelding, baking the cracked earth of the Edwards Plateau. He was looking for water, not redemption. When he smelled the heavy metallic stench of fresh blood and burning canvas, his instincts screamed at him to veer south. But the faint, rhythmic creaking of a wagon wheel spinning in the dry wind drew him down into the arroyo. The scene was a slaughterhouse. 3 Conestoga wagons lay in ruins, their canvases smoldering. The draft horses were gone, and the drivers lay sprawled in the dirt. Jasper drew his Colt .45, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for movement. The attackers had been thorough, meticulously staging the arrows to mimic a war party. But Jasper saw the deep, clean gouges of .444 Winchester rounds in the wagon spokes. This was a professional hit. He was about to turn his horse around when he heard it, not a cry, but the sharp, metallic clack of a Spencer repeating rifle lever being cocked. "Don't move a muscle or I'll drop you right out of that saddle." The voice was ragged, choked with dust and terror, but it didn't waver. Jasper slowly raised his hands, letting the reins go slack. He turned his head toward the overturned bed of the largest wagon. Wedged beneath the splintered wood, shielded by a pile of flour sacks, was a young woman. Her face was streaked with soot and blood, a calico dress torn at the shoulder, revealing dark, blossoming bruises. But it was her eyes that stopped Jasper cold. They were a piercing, defiant green, feral with the sheer desperation of a cornered animal. The heavy barrel of the Spencer was braced on a broken crate, aimed dead at his chest. And then Jasper saw what she was guarding. Tucked securely into the crook of her left arm, pressed tightly against her ribs, was an infant. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old. It was awake, its wide blue eyes staring up at the harsh sunlight, but it was utterly, terrifyingly silent. Not a whimper, not a cry. "I'm not the men who did this," Jasper said, his voice low and steady, a tone he used to calm spooked mustangs. "If I were, I wouldn't be sitting here in the open." "You're a scavenger, then," she spat, a finger tightening on the trigger. "A vulture. Ride on." "Name's Jasper Hayes. I'm just passing through to the border." "Miss, your hands are shaking. That Spencer has a hair trigger. You pull it, you'll kill me, but the recoil will knock you backward into that splintered axle." "Who takes care of the boy, then?" She hesitated. The logic pierced through her panic. She didn't lower the rifle, but her grip shifted just a fraction. "How do I know you're not one of Croft's men?" Jasper frowned. "Quentin Croft, the railroad baron out of El Paso? So you know him?" "I know of him. I know he buys up land by bleeding out the people who own it. But I don't work for him. I don't work for anybody." Jasper slowly holstered his Colt, keeping his hands visible. "Let me help you out from under there. You're losing blood from a cut on your hairline." It took 10 agonizing minutes of negotiation, but eventually Eliza Reed lowered the weapon. Jasper dismounted, moving with deliberate slowness, and helped pry the heavy wagon timbers off her makeshift bunker. As she stood, she stumbled, her legs giving out from the adrenaline crash. Jasper caught her by the elbow, his grip firm but gentle. For a fleeting second, their eyes met, 2 hardened survivors assessing the true measure of the other. Once they were in the shade of a sandstone overhang, Jasper bandaged her head using strips of clean cotton from his saddlebag. Eliza held the silent infant, rocking him mechanically. "His name is Henry," she said softly, her voice raspy. "He hasn't made a sound since the shooting started before dawn. I think the noise broke something inside him." "It's shock," Jasper said quietly, handing her a canteen. "He's alive. That's what matters." "You're his mother?" Eliza's jaw tightened. "My sister Mary. She was Croft's wife. She died 3 weeks ago. Croft said it was consumption, but Mary was the strongest woman I knew. She owned a deed to a 20-mile stretch of the Pecos River, a Spanish land grant, passed down through our family. Croft's new railway needs that water access. With Mary dead, the deed passes to her son, to Henry." Jasper understood immediately the brutal reality of frontier law. And if Henry dies or disappears, Croft, as the surviving husband, claims executor rights. He gets the land. "He doesn't want the boy," Eliza said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He wants the deed. He sent his regulators to ambush our wagon train. I hid in the floorboards with Henry. I put my hand over his mouth so he wouldn't cry, and I prayed. When I woke up, everyone was dead." Jasper looked out at the harsh horizon. He had a posse hunting him. Adding a woman and an infant to his flight to Mexico was a death sentence. He was a wanted man, a lone wolf who survived by moving fast and staying invisible. He looked back at Eliza. She was brushing the dirt from the baby's pale cheek, a tear finally escaping her eye and cutting a clean path down her soot-stained face. The cowboy knew with a sinking, absolute certainty that if he left her here, Croft's men would return to finish the job. He had spent his life running from corrupt men. Maybe it was time he stopped. "Gather whatever provisions aren't burnt," Jasper said, turning his back to her to saddle his horse. "We can't stay here. The buzzards will draw attention, and whoever shot up this wagon train will come back to check their work." Eliza looked up, surprised. "You're taking us with you?" "I'm riding south to the Rio Grande," Jasper replied, his voice gruff, hiding the sudden, fierce protectiveness blooming in his chest. "If you can keep up, I'll see you across." They rode double on the roan gelding, an uncomfortable and grueling arrangement. Eliza sat behind the saddle, her arms wrapped tightly around Jasper's waist to keep her balance, Henry slung securely against her chest in a makeshift papoose. For 2 days they pushed through the unforgiving brush of the Chihuahuan desert, moving only at dawn and dusk to avoid the blistering heat and any trailing eyes. The proximity forced an intimacy neither was prepared for. Jasper felt the steady, reassuring warmth of Eliza against his back. He felt the exhausted slump of her shoulders when she thought he couldn't notice, and the sudden rigid tension whenever a coyote howled or a shadow shifted in the mesquite. For Eliza, Jasper's broad back became the only shield between her and the hell she had just escaped. He smelled of leather, sweat, and old tobacco, but it was a grounding scent, the smell of survival. On the 3rd night, they took shelter in the ruins of an abandoned Butterfield stagecoach station. The adobe walls were crumbling, the roof long gone, but it offered a tactical advantage, high ground and thick cover. Jasper built a small, smokeless fire using dried buffalo chips hidden behind a collapsed wall. He heated beans in a tin cup and handed it to Eliza. "Eat," he ordered softly. "You need your strength to nurse the boy." Eliza took the cup, her fingers brushing his. Calloused, rough skin met soft, bruised hands. She looked up at him in the firelight. Jasper was not a conventionally handsome man. His face was a map of hard miles, scarred on the left cheek, with eyes the color of flint. But there was a quiet honor in them that Croft and his wealthy, polished associates completely lacked. "Why are you doing this, Jasper?" she asked, feeding a tiny bit of mashed bean to Henry, who accepted it with that same haunting, silent stare. "You're running from something. I saw the brand on your horse. It's a Texas Ranger mount, but the serial number is burned out. You're a wanted man." Jasper stared into the embers, his jaw tight. "A man can spend his whole life enforcing the law, Eliza, only to find out the law is just a tool for the men with the most money." I found out the hard way. A deputy I trusted put a bullet in a judge and handed me the smoking gun before the posse arrived. I've been running ever since. So you save us to save your soul? I ain't got a soul left to save, Jasper muttered, poking the fire. But I won't let a child be butchered for a railroad. The moment hung in the quiet desert air, heavy with unspoken understanding. Two outcasts, broken by the world, clinging to each other in the dark. Eliza reached out, her hand gently resting on Jasper's forearm. He didn't pull away. Suddenly Jasper's head snapped up. His hand shot out, covering the small fire with a handful of dirt, plunging them into darkness. What? Eliza started, but Jasper clamped a hand over her mouth. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. Poof beats. Slow, deliberate, spread out. According to the later confessions of a captured regulator, Quentin Croft hadn't just sent local thugs. He had hired a ruthless tracker named Deacon Hobbs, a man who had famously been dismissed from the Pinkerton agency for his excessive cruelty. Hobbs had found the slaughtered wagons, realized the baby was missing, and picked up Jasper's trail. Jasper moved with lethal efficiency. He grabbed the Spencer rifle, checked the chamber, and handed it to Eliza. Get into the old root cellar. Take Henry. Do not come out until I call your name. Jasper, no, there's too many of them, she whispered fiercely, grabbing his shirt. You can't fight them alone. I'm not dying today, Eliza. Not when I finally have a reason to live. The words slipped out before he could stop them, raw and honest. He touched her cheek, a fleeting, tender gesture, before shoving her toward the cellar trapdoor. Jasper drew his Winchester and crawled to the crumbling window frame. In the pale moonlight, he saw 4 riders dismounting at the base of the hill. They were moving in a crescent formation, hunting dogs closing in on a scent. Hayes, a voice boomed from the darkness. It was Hobbs. We know you're in there. Send the girl and the bastard child out, and you can ride away. Croft pays $1,000 for the kid. I'll split it with you. Jasper didn't answer with words. He sighted his rifle on the darkest shadow moving to his left, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The deafening crack of the Winchester shattered the desert silence. The shadow fell with a heavy thud. Chaos erupted. Gunfire tore into the adobe walls, raining dust and clay down on Jasper. He rolled, fired again, and shifted positions. He was a phantom, using every trick he'd learned in the Ranger service. He dropped a second man who tried to rush the front doorway. But Hobbs was a veteran. While his men laid down suppressing fire, Hobbs had circled around the back. Jasper heard the crunch of boot on gravel a second too late. He spun around just as Hobbs kicked the rotting back door off its hinges. Hobbs fired his revolver. Pain, hot and blinding, ripped through Jasper's left shoulder. The impact threw him backward against the stone fireplace. His rifle clattered to the floor. Hobbs stepped into the moonlight, a cruel smile twisting his face beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He leveled his smoking pistol at Jasper's chest. Stupid cowboy. Dying for another man's trash. Hobbs cocked the hammer. Boom! The gunshot didn't come from Hobbs. It was deafening, echoing from the floorboards. Hobbs' eyes went wide. He looked down at his own chest, where a massive hole had just been blown through his leather vest. He dropped to his knees, dead before he hit the dirt. Jasper gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder, and looked toward the cellar. The trapdoor was pushed open. Eliza stood there, her hands shaking violently, the heavy Spencer rifle smoking in her grip. She had fired blindly through the rotting floorboards the moment she heard Hobbs's voice. She dropped the rifle and scrambled out, falling to her knees beside Jasper. Jasper! Jasper, look at me. She ripped a piece of her skirt, pressing it frantically against his bleeding shoulder. Tears were streaming down her face. I told you to stay down, he coughed, wincing in agony. I wasn't going to let you die for us, she sobbed, her bloody hands framing his face. We are in this together. Do you hear me? Together. In the sudden ringing silence of the aftermath, a new sound pierced the night. It was weak at first, a tiny, hiccuping gasp, and then it grew into a full, loud, angry wail. Henry was crying. The spell of silence had been broken by the gunfire or perhaps by the frantic energy of his aunt, but the sound of the baby crying was the most beautiful thing Jasper had ever heard. It was the sound of life refusing to be extinguished. Jasper looked up at Eliza, seeing the fierce, beautiful warrior she had become. He managed a weak, blood-stained smile. "Well," he rasped, "I guess the boy found his voice. Now we just have to make sure he lives long enough to use it." Croft's men were dead, but the gunshot would draw the law, and Croft would not stop until he had his prize. The cowboy and the girl were bound by blood now, fleeing into a frontier that wanted them dead. The war had just begun. The historical archives of Presidio County contain a peculiar entry from the blistering summer of 1883. It notes the sudden, violent arrival of an unidentified man and woman at the clinic of Dr. Amos Burton, a disgraced former military surgeon who catered to the smugglers and outlaws of the borderlands. The official records state they were fleeing Comanche raiders, but the type of bullet Burton pulled from the man's shoulder, a heavy .45 caliber round fired from a high-end Schofield revolver, told a far more modern, corrupt tale. Eliza dragged Jasper from the ruined stagecoach station, his blood slicking her hands. Hobbs and his men were dead, their bodies left for the coyotes, but the sound of the gunfight would undoubtedly echo back to Quentin Croft. With Henry securely strapped to her chest, she hoisted Jasper's dead weight onto the roan gelding. He was fading fast, his skin pale beneath the grime, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Stay with me, cowboy," Eliza pleaded, tying his good hand to the saddle horn so he wouldn't slip. "You don't get to die on me, not after everything." Jasper's head rolled, his eyes glassy. Chinati Mountains," he mumbled, coughing up a spatter of blood. "South to Presidio. Ask for Amos Burton. Tell him the Galveston orphans sent you." For 2 agonizing days, Eliza became the hardened frontierswoman the West demanded. She navigated the treacherous sun-baked passes of the Chinati Mountains, driven by a primal need to keep the 2 fragile lives in her care, breathing. Henry, having finally found his voice, cried out his hunger and confusion, forcing Eliza to stop in the shadows of canyon walls to nurse him, all while watching Jasper's fever skyrocket. The cowboy was delirious, muttering about phantom posses and the corrupt deputies who had betrayed him. When they finally staggered into the dusty, sun-bleached border town of Presidio, they looked like ghosts. Eliza found Burton's clinic a mud-brick, adobe structure reeking of carbolic acid and cheap whiskey. Burton, a stout man with a tremor in his hands, took one look at Jasper's brand and the desperate fire in Eliza's green eyes and locked the door behind them. "Put him on the table," Burton ordered, rolling up his sleeves. "And woman, if you have a weak stomach, look away. I ain't got ether, only rye." "I've survived a wagon massacre," Eliza said coldly, her hands trembling but her voice like iron. "Tell me what to do." The extraction was a nightmare of blood and agony. Eliza had to pin Jasper's shoulders to the blood-stained wooden table as Burton probed for the lead. Jasper thrashed, a guttural scream tearing through his throat, his eyes wide unseeing in the dim lantern light. Eliza leaned over him, pressing her forehead against his sweating brow. "Look at me, Jasper. Look at me," she commanded, her voice cutting through his pain. "Hold on to me." Jasper's flint-colored eyes locked onto hers. His unbroken hand reached up, gripping her waist with bruising force. He anchored himself to her, to the smell of dust and the fierce protective aura that surrounded her. When Burton finally pulled the crushed bullet free with a sickening clink against a tin tray, Jasper passed out, his head resting against Eliza's arm. That night, a torrential desert thunderstorm rolled in, hammering the tin roof of the clinic. Jasper awoke to the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. The agonizing fire in his shoulder had settled into a dull, throbbing ache. He turned his head and saw Eliza sitting in a rocking chair, humming a soft, mournful lullaby as she rocked Henry to sleep. The baby was peaceful, his tiny hand curled in the fabric of Eliza's battered dress. She looked up, catching Jasper's gaze. The exhaustion on her face was profound. but the sheer relief that washed over her features made her breathtaking. She set the sleeping infant in a padded drawer that served as a crib and walked over to the bed. "You're awake," she whispered, brushing a damp lock of hair from his forehead. Her touch was incredibly tender, a jarring contrast to the violence they had endured. "You got us here," Jasper rasped, his voice barely a croak. "You saved my life, Eliza." "You gave me the chance to," she replied, sitting on the edge of the cot. She looked down at her hands, tracing the dried blood beneath her fingernails. "I thought I lost you on the trail. I was so angry with you for making me care." Jasper reached out, his rough, calloused fingers wrapping around her hand. He pulled it to his chest, right over his beating heart. "I spent my whole life running, Eliza. Raised in a Galveston orphanage, moving from town to town, trusting no one. The badge I wore was just an excuse to stay moving. I never had a home to fight for. Never had a family." He looked over at the sleeping infant, then back to her. "I ain't running anymore. Not from Croft. And not from you." Eliza's breath hitched. She leaned down, the space between them vanishing. Their kiss was born of desperation, grief, and the undeniable bond forged in the crucible of survival. It was a fierce promise made in the dark, a vow that they would face the coming storm together. But the frontier rarely allows for peace. The heavy oak door of the clinic suddenly rattled beneath the frantic pounding of a fist. Dr. Burton burst in, his face ashen, clutching a double-barreled shotgun. "They're here," the doctor hissed. "Croft's men. 6 federal marshals bought and paid for. They found your horse stabled out back. They're coming down the street right now." "Oh." Jasper didn't hesitate. He swung his legs out of bed, biting back a groan as his stitched shoulder screamed in protest. "Get the boy," he told Eliza, his eyes hardening back into the lethal stare of a survivor. "We're going to the river." The year 1883 saw the Rio Grande running high and treacherous, swollen by unseasonal northern storms. It was a churning ribbon of brown water that separated the corrupt jurisdiction of Texas from the sanctuary of Chihuahua, Mexico. The rain was coming down in sheets as Jasper, Eliza, and Dr. Burton slipped out the back of the clinic, moving through the muddy alleyways of Presidio. Jasper carried his Winchester in his right hand, his left arm bound tightly in a sling. Eliza carried Henry, wrapping him beneath a heavy oilskin slicker to protect him from the deluge. "There's an old wire ferry a mile south of town, run by a blind Mexican named Mateo," Burton whispered, leading them through the brush. "If you can get across the channel, Croft's marshals have no authority on the other bank. The federales down there shoot American lawmen on sight." They reached the riverbank just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a sickly, gray light through the rain. The ferry was a rudimentary, flat-bottomed barge tethered to a thick steel cable spanning the roaring river. Mateo was there, taking Burton's silver coins and hastily untying the mooring lines. "Get on," Jasper ordered, pushing Eliza gently toward the wooden planks. "Not without you," she yelled over the roar of the water. "I'm right behind you." Crack. A bullet splintered the wooden post inches from Jasper's head. He shoved Eliza onto the boat, spinning around and raising his Winchester. Through the pouring rain, Quentin Croft finally revealed himself. He was a wealthy, imposing man in a tailored wool suit that was now ruined by the mud, flanked by 5 heavily armed men. Croft's face was twisted in an ugly snarl, clutching a smoking buffalo rifle. "The deed, Hayes," Croft bellowed over the storm. "Hand over the bastard child and the land grant, and I'll let you die quick. Refuse, and I'll drown you all in this mud." "Go to hell, Croft," Jasper roared back. He fired, dropping the marshal closest to Croft. "Mateo, crank the wheel. Go!" Eliza screamed, grabbing the heavy iron winch herself and throwing her weight into it. The barge began to inch away from the Texas bank, fighting the aggressive current. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore into the water and shredded the wooden sides of the barge. Jasper took cover behind a fallen cottonwood log, providing suppressing fire. He levered the Winchester one-handed, working the action against his knee, firing with deadly precision. He dropped a second man, then a third, but Croft was advancing, utilizing the cover of the brush. Jasper's rifle clicked empty. He tossed it aside and drew his Schofield revolver. He looked back. The barge was 20 yards out, but moving too slowly. Croft's remaining men were moving to the shoreline, taking aim at Eliza's exposed silhouette as she desperately cranked the wheel. Jasper knew what he had to do. He broke from cover, charging directly at Croft's position to draw their fire. "Jasper, no!" Eliza shrieked. Croft smiled, raising the heavy buffalo rifle. He aimed center mass. Jasper fired his revolver on the run, a desperate, wild shot. The bullet struck the heavy steel action of Croft's rifle just as the Baron pulled the trigger. The weapon exploded in Croft's hands, sending shrapnel tearing into his face and shattering his right knee. Croft collapsed into the mud, screaming in agony, but one of the surviving marshals had a bead on Jasper. A bullet grazed Jasper's ribs, spinning him around. Stumbling, bleeding from 2 wounds now, Jasper threw himself into the churning waters of the Rio Grande. The current seized him immediately, violently dragging him under. The dark water filled his ears, freezing and merciless. He fought to kick to the surface, his strength failing, the weight of his boots pulling him down into the blackness. He thought of Eliza's green eyes. He thought of the quiet infant who had learned to cry. He fought. Suddenly a hand plunged into the freezing water. Small, bruised, but possessed of an impossible, desperate strength. Eliza had tied a mooring rope around her waist and leaned entirely over the edge of the barge. Her fingers locked onto the collar of Jasper's shirt. With a scream of pure exertion, aided by the old blind ferryman, Eliza dragged Jasper over the wooden lip of the boat. He collapsed onto the deck, coughing up muddy water, gasping for air. Eliza fell over him, weeping, burying her face into his wet neck, while Henry wailed safely from his basket. They looked back. Through the rain they could see Quentin Croft writhing in the mud on the Texas side, his remaining men abandoning him as the river carried the family out of their reach. Decades later, in 1905, historical property records in Bexar County would detail a landmark legal case. A young, educated man named Henry Reed Hayes walked into the courthouse clutching an original Spanish land grant. Using the courts, he systematically dismantled the crumbling empire of Quentin Croft, who lived his final days bankrupt and walking with a cane. As for the man and woman who had raised the boy, local Chihuahua parish records showed they lived a long, quiet life on a small ranch south of the border, proving that sometimes the deadliest outlaws are just men looking for something worth dying for and someone worth living for. If you enjoyed this true tale of Wild West survival, romance, and sacrifice, please hit the like button. Share this incredible story with your friends who love historical dramas. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more forgotten frontier legends brought back to life. Your support helps us uncover more hidden mysteries from the past. Leave a comment below and ring that bell so you never miss a video.